Well, we are over 2 years into the White House, and governors across the nation haven't been given emergency powers as a result of the pandemic. This allowed them to circumvent the legislative process and enact policies and do things without having to cut through a lot of red tape, but just to be able to, quote unquote, get it done. Well, now that for most people, the pandemic is really in the rearview mirror, and even the president was on 60 Minutes recently and said the pandemic is over. The White House is not ready to relinquish the emergency powers, and neither is Governor Gavin Newsom of California. In fact, he said in California, those emergency powers are not going to go away until at least February 2023, leaving open, of course, the possibility that it will extend beyond February of 2023. And again, the president and the White House have certainly let us know that this is going to continue on into January of 2023. Now, some of us warned in the very beginning, be careful, that this was the potential for a power grab. And of course, we were called alarmists, we were called conspiracists, we were censored, censured, removed from platforms, which, by the way, I now have to pause and give this official disclaimer. In accordance with YouTube policy, the vaccine has worked perfectly, though there may be an adverse effect or two, as acknowledged by Pfizer, as acknowledged by the CDC. It is by far and above in the minority, and even though the vaccines may not actually stop the spread, it has certainly been proven to slow the spread according to the fact checkers at YouTube, and this is in alignment with their community policy. And now that I've covered myself on that portion of what I have to say today, let's get into this. Some of us were called conspiracists when in reality, apparently, we were spoiler alerts, because now even the mainstream media is having to acknowledge that there have been some issues with adverse effects from the vaccine. Pfizer has acknowledged this, Moderna has acknowledged this, and then we find out this past week that Pfizer has admitted they never actually tested the vaccine before it was rolled out. They never actually tested it. Now, some of us, 2 years ago, were quoting people like Dr. Robert Malone, who was one of the researchers and one of the contributing inventors to what we call the mRNA technology, which made this particular vaccine possible. And even Dr. Malone said, and he's one of the inventors, this is a leaky vaccine. What does that mean? It does not stop the spread. But what they were trying to do was develop something that could possibly help people who were extremely old and had other severe, serious health issues going on in their life. This might be a way to help protect them. But Dr. Malone was quick to say this was never meant to be a be-all, catch-all, and to be rolled out to the mass population as a guaranteed cure. When he said that, he was immediately censored, he was discredited, he was lambasted, he was called a fraud, he was vilified. Anybody who had him on their shows, they got removed from YouTube and other social media platforms. The hit was on. And of course, in our previous commentaries about Dr. Fauci, we know exactly what that was about, but I'll save that for another day. But some of us knew what was going to happen. Some of us knew that even taking love potion number 9, you were still going to get sick. But that did not stop the president. That did not stop Dr. Fauci. That did not stop the lying legacy corporate corrupt mainstream media from making sure that they put as much guilt and pressure on over half the country. Do you remember this?
Many of us are frustrated with the nearly 80 million Americans who are still not vaccinated. This is a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
The virus that we weren't originally allowed to talk about where it came from. We had to tell the little golden book fairy tale version that a bat banged into a penguin and poof, we have coronavirus. When in reality, we know that it came from a lab. Now, again, I'm not allowed to say whether or not that was purposeful or an oops, we weren't paying attention and it got out. But we know what happened. How many times has Dr. Fauci been called before our Senate committees, and Rand Paul has tried to get to the bottom of Dr. Fauci having funded gain of function? And we know the kind of answers that we get from Dr. Fauci. Well, it turns out that at Boston University, they decided to play with a couple of the corona variants, and Shazam, Batman, they have created a killer deadly strain.
I feel like with a story like this, you could either laugh or cry.
Oh, God.
This is from the Daily Mail.
Lord.
This is playing with fire. It could spark a lab-generated pandemic. How about that? Experts slam Boston lab, where scientists have created a new deadly COVID strain with an 80% kill rate. The Omicron strain was very infectious, but not as deadly. That makes sense. If something's too deadly, people die before they can spread the disease. So these researchers took the spike protein from Omicron and put it on the alpha strain, which is more deadly, creating an extremely infectious and deadly virus, which killed 8 in 10 of the rodents infected.
Oh my God.
Why?
Wow.
Why did they make this?
Jon Stewart did a phenomenal takedown of all of this when he was a guest on Stephen Colbert. It's the closest Stephen Colbert has ever been to the truth on this particular issue since, ever and never since. But Jon Stewart's takedown, and he said his greatest fear in life is that because there are no limits on what scientists will do, that the last words ever uttered by man will be from two guys in white lab coats going, huh, that worked. Why? Is this about more fear-mongering? Is this about more control? Is this about more, we've got to make billions of money on love potion number 9s? New ones coming? I told you from the very beginning that the thing that you had to keep an eye on, a watch out for, was how they were trying to tie making sure you took the love potion along with making sure you had proof of having taken the love potion, and that eventually they wanted all of that digital, just so that everything about your life, from your finances to your driver's license to your identification, everything would be digital. And if you could not prove that you were current on your love potion number 9s, they would cut you off from your finances, cut you off from your credit, cut you off from your life. And they were test marketing that in India. In India, they don't deal in money, they deal in food rations because the people are starving. And people who did not maintain the correct level of vaccination, they all had to be vaccinated. They all had to carry it on their cell phones, their proof. And if their phone got scanned and they were not labeled as quote unquote current, they were cut off from their food. And I warned you that this kind of stuff was being played around with there as a test run for what they would like to do here. And thankfully, despite all of the censoring and the lockdown of information and being lied about, it turned out we were spoiler alerts, and little at a time now, they have had to concede, yeah, it probably did come from the lab. We knew that. The vaccine doesn't really stop the spread, that it's not a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Vaccinated people can spread it too. Yeah, and so we have watched states roll back all of the madness. Sadly, though they've reopened their states, there are still across the country hundreds of thousands of healthcare workers who are out of a job because they refused to get mandated love potion number 9 injections. And even though now those states no longer require it in certain places and in certain jobs and positions, the people who were let go have not been brought back, and that is tragic. And I'll tell you who's really waking up to all of this now is Europe. And Europe had some of the most draconian, stringent lockdowns. And even though the EU as a whole is still, part of that global agenda, there are members of the European Parliament who have said enough. And now that it is out there that Pfizer has had to admit they didn't really test this, well, members of the European Parliament are incensed. and they gathered and they wanted the CEO of Pfizer to appear before them and answer questions. He refused to come, set one of his, underlings, some lackey, to try to read the talking points. And members of the EU Parliament, they're not having it. And this is a group of individuals from the EU Parliament that are made up of Croatia, Germany, France, Italy, and they called a press conference to talk about the fact that the president of Pfizer did not appear before them, the questions they have, and the warnings that they want to give. Now, this is about a 25-minute press conference. I'm not going to air this press conference in its entirety. I have taken certain highlights of their main points, and in about a 4-minute clip that I want you to watch, this is startling. This is absolutely startling. You can find the link below to the full 20-plus minute presser that this is. Obviously, some members I couldn't play because, well, for example, the French member of the EU Parliament was speaking in French, and I'm assuming that the vast majority of my audience does not speak French. I do not speak French. I had no way of translating what it was that she was saying, but obviously she's standing there with this group in agreement with the positions they were taking. So watch this clip. Look up the full clip later. But this is not only frightening, it ought to anger you.
Thank you so much for coming to this press conference, almost 24 hours after the CEO of Pfizer, Mr. Albert Bourla, was supposed to be present in the European Parliament in the special committee to investigate what happened during COVID. And unfortunately, he was absent. He sent a representative who was unable, incapable, or unwilling to answer many of the questions asked by my colleagues.
Besides all of this, in all the discussions held yesterday and in previous auditions in COVID committee, all representatives of big pharmaceutical companies have shown a position that emphasizes the permanent threat for people's health given by the COVID pandemic, disregarding public and clear evidence about the mild symptoms given by the latest versions of SARS-CoV-2 virus. Actually, Mrs. Small yesterday needed to announce a possible new variant being more aggressive as well as more contagious, disregarding any scientific literature, assessing that such evolution of a virus in nature is just impossible. The misuse of communication, falsely cloaked in scientific truth, is just disgusting and misleading. Joined with this inexcusable lack of transparency, it has the only outcome of destroying any trace of trust in the whole scientific community by European people.
And the first question is, what exactly in these contracts? What are they hiding exactly? I mean, in the previous press conferences, I showed you some of the pages, from these contracts. This is how they were disclosed to us, and to the public, and to the press. Obviously, after some of us and some of the brave journalists asked, what are the contracts signed between the European Commission and these pharmaceutical companies? So this is how they disclose the contracts. Over 100 pages. Every contract with Pfizer, with Moderna, tens of pages of those contracts were blacked out. So yesterday when we asked, I was the one asking, and some of my colleagues asked, when are they going to fully release these contracts? The representative of Pfizer, who was sent to replace the CEO of Pfizer, said that they can't fully disclose these contracts because they have some commercial secrets over there, and they have to protect their interests. Now I'm asking you, what about the interests of our people? What about the interests of the Europeans whose money was spent, or wasted, I would say now, to buy these medical products that are not providing what they were marketed for? Because what we found out yesterday, when one of my colleagues asked if they tested, in this case Pfizer, if Pfizer tested, if their medical product is stopping the spread of the virus, we were shocked to find out yesterday that they haven't tested their vaccine to see if it's stopping the spread of the virus. So we are now more than a year after the green certificate, the digital green certificate was imposed in the European Union. People were forced to be vaccinated with a medical product in order to exercise their basic fundamental rights. And they were told, and we were told, we were voted against the green certificate, but many of our colleagues voted in favor of it because they believed what these companies had said, that if you get vaccinated, you will not be infected and you will not spread the virus. They even ran a campaign and said, get vaccinated in order to keep your grandmother and your parents healthy. And we find out now, after more than a year, that when they requested the special marketing authorization, they haven't tested the vaccine to see if it's stopping the spread of the virus. So I'm asking again, and we are asking again, what are they going to hide? What do they hide exactly? Now, if you look on the map here, this is released by the Eurostat. It's not from us. If you look on this map, you will see that the countries with the highest vaccination rate have right now the highest mortality rate. So obviously we asked, is there a connection between being vaccinated and having a higher mortality rate? Everybody's avoiding answering this, I would say, logical question.
So for those of us who never went along to get along, are you feeling slightly vindicated? Are you feeling like, I knew I wasn't crazy. I knew there was something up. I knew it. Why isn't our media talking about this, Pastor Marty? Well, let me remind you why our media is not talking about this.
Good Morning America is brought to you by Pfizer.
CBS Health Watch sponsored by Pfizer.
Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer.
ABC News Nightline. Brought to you by Pfizer.
Making a difference. Brought to you by Pfizer.
CNN Tonight. Brought to you by Pfizer. Early Start. Brought to you by Pfizer. Friday night on Aaron Burnett Out Front. Brought to you by Pfizer.
This Week with George Stephanopoulos is brought to you by Pfizer.
This weather report brought to you by Pfizer.
Today's countdown to the royal wedding is brought to you by Pfizer.
And now a CBS Sports Update brought to you by Pfizer.
Meet the Press Data Download brought to you by Pfizer.
This portion of CBS This Morning sponsored by Pfizer.
On how to find the hidden sugars in the American family diet, sponsored by Pfizer.